3 hours later, 5 days later, 6 hours later, 10 minutes later, 9 minutes later. Meanwhile, 10 minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 months later, many weeks later, 7 days later, 8 hours later, 1.25 seconds later, not even 2 minutes later, 2 minutes later, 1 hour later, 30 minutes later, 25 minutes later, 20 minutes later, 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later, 4 hours later, 9 weeks later, many minutes later, 3 days later, 6 months later, 25 minutes later, 6 weeks later, 29 minutes later, 45 minutes later, the next morning, 5 minutes later, many scientists later, hours later, 22 minutes later, a few minutes later, 1 hour later, 30 minutes later, 6 hours later, 3 hours later, 1 month later, 97 minutes later, 24 hours later, 2 hours later, 50 minutes later, 25 minutes later, 10 hours later, 9 hours later, many hours later, 1 idiot later, 6 hours later,
1 week later, 1 million milliseconds later, 40 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 6 weeks later,
15 minutes later, 35 minutes later,
2 months later, 1 hour later,
2 hours later, 5 days later,
a very 5 hours later, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 50 seconds later, 27.32719 seconds later, 4 weeks later, 12 hours later, 347 microseconds later, 30 minutes earlier, 15 minutes later, a half an hour later, 90 minutes later, 1 second later, 31 days later, many moments later, 4 seconds later, 1.5 minutes later, seconds later, 12 hours later, a couple minutes later, 30.1 minutes later, 6.5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, many hours later, a few hours later, 10 minutes later, 2 hours later, 39 minutes later, several hours later, 22 seconds earlier, 5 hours later, 3 hours later, 5.5 minutes later, 99 hours later, 1 fund later, several unproductive hours later, over 10 attempts later, 2 days later, 10 seconds later, the next lap, 3 months later, 50 hours later, 2 hours of travel later, several seconds later, 14 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 days later, many attempts to fix the bell later, 4,000 hours later, earlier that day, 56 seconds later, 7 minutes later, later that night, a couple of ghosts later, a few hours later, a few moments later, the next morning, many eternities later, 3 weeks earlier, many miles later, 3 hours later, 2.5 minutes later, later that day, stupid early the next day, 3 hours earlier, 1 hour later, 1 cookie later, a lot of boring math later, numerous minutes later, 8 years later, many questions later, a number of days later, many arguments later, 20.5 minutes later, 15.5 minutes later, 3.9 nanoseconds later, the next morning, later, 95 seconds later, 2 seconds later, 7 hours ago, 5 seconds later, several hours later, 1 later, 7 minutes later, several hours later, 8 minutes later, 7 minutes later, party later, 8 hours earlier, a few pants later, a few tic-tacs later, minutes later, 3 minutes later, 5 hours later, 7 minutes later, 60 minutes later, 20 minutes and 30 seconds later, 2 seconds earlier, a number of hours later, 7 minutes later, 10 sleepless hours later, 3 minutes later, a bit earlier, 1 hour later, 1 scary road later, limited time only, 8 months later, approximately 10 hours later, 1 stormy long bathroom trip later, 3 hours later, 365 days later, 3 hours later, 15 minutes later, 2,000 years later, 5 hours later, 15 minutes later, 1 minute ago, several hours later, 1 studio session later, soon after again, 19 minutes later, 7 years earlier, 7 days later, 2 hours later, many seconds later, later, 2 hours later, 2 days later, 3 hours later, 2 hours later, 2.5 minutes later, a few moments later, 9 years later, a few hours later, 1 year later, 12 hours later,